webinar series today, episode 5, and the theme is localization. Sorry, I'm a little sick. Localization of aid, decolonization or not. And today we are very lucky to have two panelists, Alicia Marabas and Hamimu Masoudi. If you can please both put your videos on so we can just say hi to you. And we're also lucky to have a respondent who I'll introduce a little bit later. So today, I'd just like to acknowledge that the Kampala Initiative and PHM Uganda, as well as the Innovations for Development, have put a lot of effort into organizing these sessions. This has been a series of a few that started last year, and they're really trying to tackle and grapple with issues of decoloniality and trying to locate some of the challenges that we face on the continent with regards to health equity, with regards to programming, and with regards to aid, and bringing these issues into conversation and speaking truth to power. So we're really fortunate today to have an exciting panel, and we will give each panelist 10 minutes to speak. I would like to invite everybody to contribute. Today is a very informal and session where we want to learn. We want to hear your voices. And so I'd like to invite you to write your questions into the chat box. And immediately after the speaker has presented, we will I will take one or two questions of clarity, and later down the program, we will have some time for more discussion. So this is really a platform for all of us to engage. So I want to also, at the start, thank Jovia, Danny, Frank, and Ravi for the hard work that you've put into organizing this and the passion with which you center the conversations and the needs of the continent to bringing us into conversation, and the passion with which I see the vision you have to bring health equity to all. So before I hand over to the panel, I have been asked to share a slide, which I will do, just to locate some of the conversation for us. So in one of the presentations last year, I think the recording is available, I presented on this framework of analysis that comes from a few decolonial scholars, such as Sabelo Ndlovu-Gacheni, Nelson Maldonado Torres, Ramon Gross-Fugel, Sylvia Tamale, and others, who have been thinking deeply about how coloniality, the remnants of the colonial past, continue to manifest in multiple levels today. And they've organized these into power, knowledge, and being. And in our discussion on localization today, I would like us all to try to locate these conversations into power, knowledge, and being. And when we're thinking about power, to really think about where does the oppressive power lie? Who's the powerless? How are technologies of power continuously being utilized to cause oppression? And this could be racialized power, could be gendered power, could be financial power, it could be linguistic power, it could be all kinds of power. Then when it comes to the coloniality of knowledge, I want us to pay attention to the words that are being used. Words like localization. What does that mean? Who's using the word? Who's defining the words? And so on, and for who do they serve? And then when it comes to the coloniality of being, it's really about recentering African people in their fullest complexity of our humanity. and to embrace that we are important parts of these conversations, and to acknowledge that for many, many centuries, we have faced oppressive power. And we have to undo and dismantle and unlock those power and find our own. So with that, I would like to stop sharing and just introduce the first panelist. Yes. So we're going to start today with Alicia, who's become a friend of ours, and who invited us to many conversations and really who introduced me to this topic. Alicia is a scientist at FHI 360. She's a social behavior scientist with more than 15 years of research experience in HIV, substance use, qualitative, quantitative methods in clinical and community-based research and program. And since 2019, she's been leading on both domestic and international efforts in decolonization and global equity in development at FHI 360, and she's training students, internal staff, technical assistants with government and private funding. In 2021, was a social lab and systems innovator, and was awarded by the reimagination of the INGO and Global Civil Society project called Ringo. She's also a professional instructor at the George Washington University and an adjunct professor of Duke Global Health Institute and a visiting professor of UC San Francisco. So we are very fortunate to have Alicia here to share some views and perspectives from the global north on the localization of aid. Go ahead, Alicia.
Thank you, Shanaz. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. So what I'll do is share some slides. There's not many, and they are very focused with intention to contribute to our conversation today. So the first thing, as Shanaz mentioned, which I appreciate, is a little bit about myself. So I am a scientist at a very, very large INGO, and I'm also a professor. But those are the things that I do. They're not entirely who I am. So what I'm here today to tell you all is that, yes, I am from the global north, and I am quite literally a child of the global south. And I'm here today to tell you all what I've seen, what I've heard, and the things that I've seen go poorly when we have interactions and work that takes place between the global north and the global south. So I cannot speak for all of the work that happens in the global north, but I can speak quite clearly to the problems I have seen working in this space. So the first question I was asked to respond to was, what are perspectives of localization or locally led development from the vantage point of global north actors? So I thought I would call out two very specific definitions. One of them is the one that my INGO FHI 360 uses. And what they define, and they don't really make a distinction between localization and locally led development, by the way. In all of what I've seen, those are treated as is synonymous to each other. So my INGO defines localization as the process in which local actors, individuals, communities, networks, organizations, private entities, and governments set their own agendas, develop solutions, and bring the capacity, leadership, and resources to make those solutions a reality. USAID, which I'm sure all of us have heard of, defines it as intentional changes to policies, processes, staffing, and funding to equitably empower local actors, strengthen local systems, and facilitate local leadership for the sustainability of development. And when you read these definitions, you're not really sure what they mean, you're in good company. I don't know what they mean either. So I want us to sit with those, and certainly we can come back to them, and I'm happy to put them back on the screen. The next thing, when we think about decoloniality or coloniality of power, one of the questions I was asked to speak to was power inequities. How do I see them come up? How are they barriers to what real localization would be? And for me, the central power dynamic that I think we have to deal with is that of funder to recipient. So the idea that even when my organization is working with Global South partners, it's still a relationship of funder to recipient. Because most of the time, my INGO or INGOs like mine have been the recipient of the funding and are then giving funding to other organizations. We would call that the prime organization. I'm sure this is language you all have heard before. So even though it might be nonprofit to nonprofit, there's still a power inequity of funder or source of funding and recipient of funding. So as a result, there's still all of these built-in power structures, and each of them comes down to whoever is holding more funding or all of the funding has more or all of the power. And I think for me, and I think in a lot of the work that I've seen, that power dynamic of someone holds the money and someone has to receive that money is always going to be in opposition to the real goals of localization. Because how is any entity, any community, any organization going to really be empowered if they themselves are not either the source of the funding or have direct access to that funding? So if that dynamic is always there, we're always going to have these power inequities. And I'll also note that when we talk about, and in some of those definitions, you saw something along the lines of empowerment, that implies a lack of power as though there weren't structural systemic reasons for how it happened in the first place. So if we're going to say that people need to be empowered, or organizations or entities or communities need empowerment, it's as though we're implying the lack of power happened randomly, or that it's as easy as saying, take power back. It's not. And if we're not going to address these dynamics and these power inequities, we can't truly localize, not in any meaningful way. So the next question I was asked to respond to was, how do international actors, how do really all actors foster capacity strengthening and sustainability? There's many answers to that question. There's many ways in which we need to do that, but the one that resonates in the work that I've seen the most was to rethink the timeline, the goals, and the outcomes of our partnership. And what I mean by that is this goes back to the funding piece. So first, it allows us to change that dynamic that local organizations, which in and of itself is a problem, but local organizations cannot always be the subcontractor and must be the prime. And if and only if it is appropriate, maybe international organizations, INGOs, those actors, maybe they become subcontractors. But if they don't have something to meaningfully contribute and they're not working in solidarity, then they should not be. They should not be included at all. The challenge is that these dynamics cannot change overnight. And it must mean that the way that we partner has to be for longer term partnerships than any one source of funding or any one project. We cannot make and form meaningful, sustainable capacity strengthening relationships when all we are doing is following one source of funding after another source of funding. There have to be long-term goals that we share. We have to discuss the long-term goals of the partnership and what that relationship looks like. We also have to document how these large organizations like my own would truly support the work of local partners, not in theory, not in a way that is tied solely to funding, not for any one funding cycle, but longer intentional partnerships where the strengthening of goals goes in both directions, and where organizations that are enormous and take more resources document how they are going to support and work in solidarity with these other organizations. I also want to note that if we are really thinking about the coloniality of power and of knowledge, that means we need to expect negotiations at all steps of the partnership. So that means how much funding goes to whom, documenting what it is for, how to advocate for more equitable funding, and that is irrespective of whether or not we win a given proposal or source of funding or not. The goals cannot change because we say, oh, well, we thought we were going to win more money than we did. Now we have to change things. No, either this is the relationship and the nature of the power dynamics or it's not. And so the last thing that I want to respond to is, how can foreign funders engage with local partners? And by the way, if anyone has noticed, I am not using the term donor because it's not donations. I'm intentionally using the word funding, and we can certainly talk about more about why. Lastly, the reality of how funders engage with local partners is often symbolic. And when I say symbolic, what I mean is it's often an enormous funding organization inviting one single voice to present, or a couple of single voices. It's very rare that you see organizational leadership to organizational leadership at a table really discussing the power inequities and imbalances and how to overcome them. It's almost always, we have to go into the space of funders, and we can only represent very small entities and not entire organizations or collectives. This is often asked of actors, especially Global South actors, with no compensation of any kind. The expectation is that you want to donate your time and share your lived experience and your expertise without equal exchange, without compensation, and without long-term discussion of what that means and what investment is being asked of you and also of other global North or South actors. I want to call out a really wonderful piece about how it should be, which is by Irandu and colleagues, which I'm sure many of you have seen, which is that all international funders of science, does not matter what kind, and also of development in Africa, need to implement short-term and long-term changes that innovate sustainable funding. And if it doesn't center local researchers and organizations, it should not be done. And there should only be partnership with Western institutions when their work is in solidarity and when it is useful as identified by those scholars. So I'll stop there. I know we only have 10 minutes. I would invite any questions or comments, and I appreciate you all so much for inviting me to this conversation.
Thank you so much, Alicia. You've given us a lot to think about, and I'm glad you're leaving your slide up because it can provoke some more thoughts. So I'm just looking at the chat, and I see that we've got a question from Danny. Given your vantage point, how do you assess or situate US localization initiatives based on your highlights of what it ought to be? And there's a second question by Harold, which says, can someone provide a reference for that the speaker just mentioned? So Alicia, both of those to you.
Sure. So first I'll answer Harold's. So Harold, what I can first do is go right back to the slides so you can see it, but also I did share my slides with Javaya. They are for everyone to consume, so you should be able to receive these slides. But in the meantime, I am happy to go back so that you can see the reference that I'm referring to. So thank you, Danny, for this thoughtful question about how do we situate US localization initiatives. I would say that we have to do so with a healthy dose of skepticism. And by that, I mean, even though the power imbalances are very, very real, if ever there are interactions that any of your organizations or that you all are having with localization discussions and Western organizations, whether it's funder or not, I would walk into a space with the list of demands that you have for how localization is being defined, what it means and what it does not mean, examples of how this individual or this entity expects it to look, and with a very clear understanding of what it is that you want to get out of that relationship. And I say this because even though we have these definitions of what these things mean, often they're just definitions, and people don't understand that you cannot do any of those things unless you address and change almost every imbalance in power that's in the room before you talk about localization. So I would hope that any Global South voices, any African scholars and experts can come into the room with the expectations of what you require before you're even willing to engage in this conversation. Because the assumption that it's going to be asked of you, it may not be. And these definitions don't necessarily speak at all to an actual translation of power, knowledge, and resources. So even though it's not fair to always have to be that self-advocate, I think that's how we have to situate these initiatives, with some skepticism, with a list of demands, and that has a lot to do with how it ought to be, based off of many African scholars and voices. There has to be the expectation that you're demanding what you require to be in the space and to even contribute in the space. I hope that answers your question, Danny, and I think I see some other comments as well.
Yeah, go ahead, Alicia, if you want to directly respond. So Alison is saying, very aligned with your analysis and values. How do you see the strengthening of local ecosystems, something of local actors working in concert towards a common goal, as promising necessary strategy to upend these power imbalances?
Sure. Thank you for this question. Was it Alison you said, Shanaz?
Yes, Alison.
Thank you. Thank you, Alison. So I think the strengthening of local ecosystems has everything to do with platforms like Kampala Initiative. There is so much scholarly expertise, lived experience, and thought that needs to be exchanged amongst actors who are in an African context or in any context where the power imbalances and the history and the legacy of colonialism is very pertinent. And there's still a stealing and a usurping of resources. There's so much scholarly thought and expertise and opinions that need to be discussed amongst local actors and voices and experts. Because even if you have, say, a certain region, there are many entities in Uganda who are doing work in decoloniality and trying to upend power imbalances. But if there's not solidarity and consistency in discussion of what the needs are for these local actors, for these entities, for these regions, for these countries, for the continent, we're still bifurcating. We are still working in some ways in competition rather than in solidarity. And that solidarity includes with local actors who themselves have different power imbalances. A Makerere University in Uganda and a Kampala Initiative in Uganda and other teeny tiny NGOs that may be less recognizable, they're going to encounter different power imbalances. And they could do much more to strengthen how they're all working together to address power imbalances. It's not always the same relationship of global north to south, depending on that organization itself and the kind of resources they have access to locally. So I would say there has to be a lot more solidarity within local ecosystems and addressing of how to advocate on behalf of the entire ecosystem. And I think once those kinds of initiatives and goals are set, then the larger conversation of how can external actors like an INGO of mine or other international actors, how do we then work in solidarity with the goals and requirements you all have set forth? I think that doesn't happen enough. And I think it requires platforms like Kampala Initiative and a lot more sustainability and solidarity locally and then more internationally. And to that point of promoting and supporting that solidarity in a sustainable way, I think that's also a question from Alison. Thank you for that. I think that also goes back to much more long-term partnerships. And I hate to say that that has to be done without funding, but I think the reality is we need the time to adequately determine what those shared agendas are, what that liberation might look like, what solidarity means for our region and for our actors. That has to be done over time. And I think in solidarity means it cannot be tied to external sources of funding. There has to be a long-term commitment to the shared partnership, the shared ideas, the shared principles, and the shared goals for growth and undoing power imbalances that this region and this entity and this ecosystem, if you will, have to have. So I don't want it to be something that happens outside of sustainable funding. But to start, that might be how it has to be. And that's a commitment, of course, not everyone can make. You're in a position of privilege when you can say, no, it doesn't require funding. But it is to say there have to be some resources that are allocated even before you might recognize and realize external sources of funding that then need to become yours to take over and yours to sustain over time. This is not an easy answer. This is just a preliminary conversation. I want to also note really, really quickly, in my slides, you all will see my email address is open for anyone who would wish to comment or contact me further. This is just the start of a conversation, I hope. And in my slides, you'll see my contact information as well. So I don't want to go above my time, Shani. Sorry to take over. I just don't want to take too much time.
Thank you so much, Alicia. This was incredible and an important way to start. So we will continue the conversations, but I'm really pleased that you highlighted the importance of an initiative such as the Kampala Initiative. And before we move to our next speaker, I would like to just call Ravi to just share a little bit about what is the Kampala Initiative so that those who aren't familiar with it know and can engage. Thanks, Ravi.
All right, thanks very much, Shanaz, and welcome everybody. I'll just take a moment, and if you look back in the chat, along with the good comments and questions, there is a link. I will repaste that link as well, and that's to the Kampala Initiative's webpage, and you can learn more. The Kampala Initiative is a civil society space. It's a democratic space where different activists or progressive organizations can come together, share ideas, propose solutions. We are not focused on the political analysis of aid. We believe that there's been quite a lot. What we're looking to do is to build on that analysis, try something new. The Kampala Initiative was started in 2019. We're now in our third year, and I encourage you to explore the webpage. If you're not already signed on to the Kampala Declaration, and you can find that link both on the webpage and I'll post it in this chat, feel free to click there. Read through it, and assuming you agree, sign on, and that will add you to the Beyond Aid email group. So without saying more right now, let me hand back to Shanaz, and happy to take any questions about the Kampala Initiative as we go further. Thanks.
Thank you, and I'm appreciating that there's a lively discussion that's continuing in the chat. That's wonderful, and let's keep it going. And now I would love to invite and welcome Mr. Hamimu Masudi from Health Poverty Action. Hamimu is a Ugandan communication professional, policy analyst, and social mobilizer. He has over 15 years track record in designing and implementing social justice campaigns and cultivate national, regional, international groundswell of support in Africa and beyond. Hamimu is currently a policy and campaigns officer at Health Poverty Action and co-chair of track-changing working group of the Kampala Initiative on Beyond Aid and Decolonisation of Global Health. Previously, Hamimu worked with minority rights groups, International, Equality Now, Plan International UN Millennium Campaign on various issues, including climate change, Indigenous people's rights, child rights, public health, and the Millennium Development Goals. Hamimu is a graduate of MA in Public Policy. He also holds a BSc in Mass Communication. So we really do are lucky to have you to speak with us today. And I've been told you'll be speaking to us a little bit about localization within the perspectives of decolonization and the shifting of power. So welcome, over to you.
All right, thanks a lot, Shanaz, for that introduction. But also, I also want to take this opportunity to thank the organizers of this event for, first of all, identifying this subject, which is very critical, but also inviting me to join the panel, to join Alicia on this panel. So it's a pleasure sitting here with you, Alicia. And also, I also need to show how excited I am to be speaking to our audience, the people who have signed up. It shows us a lot that we are doing something that probably is moving us in the right direction. Yeah, so I'll try as much as possible to speak within the theme that I've been assigned, localization within the perspective of decolonization and shifting power. But I will have my conversation. I don't have a slide, so I'll speak from a few of my notes here, but also from my head and also out of my experience, working first of all from my education, but also traversing the continent and also engaging with other activists on this subject. So my presentation is going to rotate around the issue of funding. And so I want to underscore the point that what we are dealing with is the charity model of financing when it comes to issues of development. I will also probably take a few minutes to discuss something about development and the challenge we're having with it. Then I will look at the history of global, poverty. We need to locate it. We need to know where it's coming from. And then definitely I'll look at the modern, neoliberal economic policies. And then, try to underscore the point, maybe also answer the question whether localization is helping us to address some of these challenges. Yes, so I will also want to draw a distinction here that the discussion is framed around the conversations within the humanitarian sector. But this could go beyond the sector and may probably have to reach out to a few other actors, the national states, the countries in the global north and the global south, and their relationships with the countries in the global south, what we are calling the majority world and the minority world. Majority for the global south countries, and then minority for the rich, well-off global north countries. So in terms of funding, we need to know who's giving you this money and what the intentions are, the motivations around this. So it's out of goodwill, if I could say, that this money is the funding is being channeled to support communities and peoples who are living in situations of poverty. So this money comes in as charity. We can call it charity, we can call it aid, but at the end of the day, it is given out to assist, to help. So it's from a helping hand. But the key question around this model of financing is to interrogate, whether this is actually helping the poor, especially if you look at the relationships, the transactions that are going on between countries in the global south and the global north. The transaction, the scale seems to tilt higher in favor of the global south. So there is a lot of resources that are leaving countries in the global south, more so Africa, toward the global north. If you compare that with the amount of money that is being sent to address poverty issues in Africa now, the difference is big. It's very small. So the contribution that comes from the global north is actually less than what is leaving Africa. So I think that one brings us into a situation where we're supposed to ask the question, who is actually helping who? Because it's not helping. You're not helping, because most of the money, and for your own information, this money is leaving most of these places in Africa, Latin America, and India, not through the right channels. It's going through channels such as malpractices of, corporations, the practices they do, how they extract wealth from the global south. There's a lot that goes on around there. So I cannot dig in, but we can always do some research on our own. But there's a lot there's a lot of malpractices that are happening that are leading to the extraction of wealth from the global south in cooperation with agents within these countries, in Africa, for example. So I don't want to say it's just a situation that is happening by actors in the global north, but there are certain, partners. They have partners who are willing to play a role in this extraction of wealth. Then, so I wanted to underscore that point, that yes, it is money coming in. It looks like charity, it looks like helping, but in reality, it is not helping. If you look at the dynamics of the financial relationship between the two divides. I also want to underscore the point around the issue to do with development. So what we know about development is moving from, growing our economies from a certain GDP to a certain level. And we try to mimic what the global north is, the industrial world, how far they have gone in terms of accumulation of income and material wealth. But I think in a global dispensation, that is not the aspiration of everyone. There are very many communities who do not aspire to just have material possession or accumulation of wealth. That's not their motivation. They are more interested in living in peace with their environments, with the ecosystem. I'm talking about communities such as indigenous communities. All they need to do is live in a healthy environment where we are having the biodiversity, the ecosystem, everything is working, is functioning, and they see themselves as part of this big picture. So the accumulation of wealth or moving towards that GDP kind of stuff may not be a motivation for them. So I just wanted to underscore that so that we start to appreciate that, that yes, there are other ways we need to see progress, okay? Not just from the development point of view, but from where communities are and how we define who is poor and who's not poor. Yes, so I want to also to locate the origin of global poverty, the poverty that the funds that are coming in, what we are trying to localize. Where did this poverty come from? I think it's always very important to go to the root causes, because that's where you can have, you make the right interventions to have a lasting and sustainable change. So most of the global origin, the origin of global poverty is located in the colonial occupation of these lands in the global south, where we're trying to localize things. So like most of you are aware, I don't want to patronize you by explaining to you the colonial project, but it was an extractive, corrupt project that was bent towards extracting from communities and taking away. So for over a century doing that, I think you leave communities in need. You have disenfranchised them a lot, such an extent that probably it will be hard to compare yourselves, if you are from the global north, to those in the global south. And that is how we start to discuss issues of inequality. So that's very important to know. So in terms of localizing the subject we're having here, we need to know what we are localizing. So at the moment, we're looking at issues of sending funds, giving, letting communities decide, not necessarily 100%, but giving them money so that they can decide, or they can become, agents. But the key question is, what are you trying to address? Because it's beyond funding. There are other issues that are embedded in situations of poverty. So the coloniality, those legacies that we have just mentioned, how are they being addressed by localization? That is a key question that needs to be answered. And then definitely the modern, policies of neo-colonial, models of dispensation, where we are having countries in the global south polluting the environment and leading to global warming, and then communities in the global south, the poor ones, bearing the effects of droughts, of floods, and lots of things that are going on. So how are we factoring these into localization? Or we just talk about funds and that's all, we're happy with that? I think that's also another question. Then the final thing I wanted to talk about is that, yes, the conversation is seated within the humanitarian sectors. We're trying to check on each of us, trying to hold each other to accountable. How much have we localized? But I think that is beyond what needs to end poverty. There are certain things that need to be done between states and countries. Those policies that we are having, the best example is the current standoff we're having about the TRIPS waiver, okay? The pandemic, I think, gave us a very good example on how unfair trading policies are and what needs to be done to make sure that things are leveled. So I think that is an issue that probably may not be handled by the humanitarian sector. We can do something, we can influence, but I think that is can best be done by countries, the community of countries sitting down and then doing something. We can always influence them. So yeah, that's very critical also to point out, because without that, then we'll not be addressing the structural issues that are keeping people in poverty. Yeah, then yes, the other thing that I also wanted to discuss is the issue of localization beyond the term that we hear about being thrown about, but what is desired at the very lowest level of the community. We get sometimes, confused, or we mix sometimes some of the things where we have community-based interventions or organizations or whatever you might want to call them, and then community-led interventions or organizations. I think there's a big difference here. If you look at community-based, it's just the location. And so we shall have a very big INGO just having an office in the global south. But whatever happens in terms of intervention doesn't change. It's the same thing. It still plays within the power dynamics that we are trying to address. The colonial legacies are not yet addressed. The issues of policies, of neoliberal, models are not yet addressed, are still in place. It's just the change in location. That same thing also happens within countries. So we have a national NGO that probably can go into a community. It's just based into that community, but it's not led. So, but the desired is when communities lead, where they're in charge, they decide the problem for themselves, they determine what intervention they want to handle, and then the finances that are needed to accomplish that. I think that, for me, is still a gap. That's not what we are trying to address. Most of the time, the problem is being cut out. It's being framed by probably the log frame, which the donors always like when you're applying for a proposal. Yeah, so the problem is not sometimes, most of the time is not yet, I'm not saying throughout, but most of the time is not decided by the communities. It's something that is being brought to them. I think there is an issue with that. Then finally, I want to end by saying what needs to be done. So the key challenges of institutional donors, okay, the fundraising people and everyone, what can we do to make sure that we achieve localization? I think what is needed here is first of all to have to shift power. I think that's also part of my comment, to shift the power of determining who takes the decision in terms of creating the problem that we're trying to address, who drives the process. I think that's very critical, that needs to be addressed. Then the donors also need to support the decolonization processes. They should not just talk about localization. Decolonization is a very sensitive subject. No one wants to touch about. It's a big elephant in the room. But I think it also needs to be handled concurrently with localization. Thank you very much, and I'll stop here and hand it over to you, Shahnaz.
Thank you so much, Hamimo, for this really interesting, fascinating, thought-provoking input. You've really highlighted the complexity of the issue. You've named a lot of the power, where the power sits, and it really lies in these bureaucratic processes when you have to do a log frame, when you have to do a report, when you have to answer to. So this accountability issue of how do we shift, where's the instruments of power? You've brought a lot of that into question. And this is, Alicia, also a time in this question of how do we push back with the list of demands? And it becomes this interplay between, we are given a lot of demands. So as Africans, we have to fill up, we have to do all the work. We are being demanded to do a lot of things, but we don't know how to shift that and say, but actually, this is not our priorities. We have other priorities, and we would like to name them, and we will demand them in our way that represents the complexity of our own dynamic. So I think, thank you for raising these issues of voice, of framing the issue, of the complexity of the context and the difficulty of navigating it, you know. And I now would like to, I'm not sure we have enough time for questions, but I see there is one, and I will just raise it, and then I think I'd like to invite a respondent. So we'll just give you another minute. Is that okay, Hamimu? So Labila earlier, she mentions the issue of tax evasion by corporations and illicit financial flows, which is an important point in this discussion. Dan Awala, my comrade, he speaks about the extraction that's done in many different forms, you know, by foreign currency, and the conditions. Again, this is where they place conditions on us, but that they don't favor the global south. And Danny Gatto says, Hamimo, I like the emphasis on community-led rather than community-based. Again, it's a language issue, a slight shift in the word, and it completely changes. A local NGO can equally be sustainers of the unequal status quo. We need to be reflexive. We need to do the reflexive work to imagine how we, as NGO fraternities, are promoters of coloniality. And this is partly why these conversations are so important, so that we can realize and recognize that as colonized beings, we are all colonized. We perpetuate coloniality in different forms. And the reflexivity allows us to raise that awareness, and that's the levers of change. Harold says, thank you for an excellent analysis and overview. It seems clear that localizing a failed development aid model cannot be a solution. The model itself needs to be changed. And he asks, do you have examples of where that may have been done successfully and can be replicated? So I'm giving you 1 minute, Hamimo.
Okay, thanks a lot for that. Yes, I'll go straight to your response and say that, rather to the question, and say that there are certain innovations that are happening. They are still anecdotal, but these need to be taken to scale. I'll give an example of mental health, okay? So we know very well that the issue of institutionalization, asylum, is a colonial thing. But this has been abandoned long time ago, even by countries that promoted it, and now they are taking the issue of they're adopting the community model, where they're closing down institutions except for those serious mental health conditions, where people need specialized attention. So this is an area that some actors have created a very good partnership, what we could call a co-creation as an approach in decolonization, where we have a funder, gives in money and gives enough room, flexi kind of funding, gives enough room to the local actor to decide how to mix the modern medicalized approaches with the localized approaches. Don't forget that under decolonization, most of the time we're supposed to be restoring some of the models and approaches that had been destroyed during colonialism. So the best example I'll give is the friendship bench. I've said that before, the friendship bench in Zimbabwe, which has mixed up these two very well. I think those are one of the areas that, one of the examples that I can give on how we can do things the right way. There are very many, some of them are hidden, but because we're not focused on them, they can't come to the fore. But I wanted to end here also, if you may allow me, by underscoring one important point. When we're talking about decolonization, we are becoming too political. and we're talking about issues of reparations, we're talking about issues of redistribution and taxation, and most people don't want to discuss these things. Fine, that's understood. We can give it some time and we can continue to dialogue, but there are certain simple things that can be done, like debt relief, handling the debt conditionalities the right way, okay? Reforming the policies, the international policies around trade, drug policy, and climate change. I think those are small little things, steps that we need to start with. But everyone is running away from them. We can have dialogue about those other, heavy metal kind of decolonization and reparations. But I think these are some of the steps that we need to start taking. Thank you.
Thank you, Hamimo. I love that you believe that policies is a small thing to change. But I agree with you. I think that as a movement, we do need to be strategic and find a lever with which we can, advocate. And we have movements to learn from. For example, in South Africa, and even the struggle in Palestine, they chose the BDS campaign, boycott, divest, and sanctions. And certain strategies like that, if repeated, they actually have a dent. They make a dent. And so I think, instead of trying to tackle everything, and sometimes we need to actually think about what is the capacity that we do have and how can we be effective by tackling something where we can make an instrumental change. And so I'm looking forward to more thoughts from you to lead us towards what is this, these points that we can really move. So now I would like to welcome a comrade, William Kidega. And we're just inviting you to be a respondent. I would like you to please introduce yourself. And if you can share with us, there's been a rich discussion prior in the planning phases, especially around accountability. And so I really don't want to take any time and just welcome you to the table to really share with us. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Shanaz, and good to see everyone. Good day, respectively. I am called William Kidega. I am a very passionate, I should call myself an enthusiast for aid accountability. I've worked previously on accountability efforts, but also as a leader on different projects funded by DFID, USAID, also funded by a number of partners from the EU. Specifically, I do have a background in health policy, but also with a Master of Science in Health Services Management. Currently, I do a lot of random work, including consultancies, evaluations, but also supporting organizations to develop their capacities in terms of advocacy, especially underscoring policy advocacy. So very quickly, I want to again thank Shanaz for convening this engagement with all the organizers. I will also make note that I'm not going to share slides. I'm going to talk off the cuff. And talking off the cuff will mean talking through a few points here and there, guided by questions that I was given by the team, but also share perspectives from my previous engagements and the work that I've been doing over time. There will be random thoughts, and some of them will be in form of questions, and I presume a lot of insights will come from the discussions. Let me also take this opportunity to appreciate Alicia and Hamimu for the thoughts shared. They've made my life easier, and this will set the stage for the conversation. So the first question that I was given to respond to and also to share perspectives on is, can aid be accountable? And then what are the trade-offs to realize aid accountability? But also above all, what role can civil society in Africa do to make aid more accountable? And I start this way, and I say that for aid to be accountable, there is certainly great need to appreciate and have a common understanding of what it is, what is aid accountability, who is involved, and who is accountable to who. And I'm glad that Hamidu mentioned this, and Alicia in our conversation also raised this. a number of definitions from different scholars about on aid accountability, but specifically, I would like to underscore one from a gentleman called Chris Roche in publications linked to partnerships for effective development. They range from 2006 and 2009, who refer to aid accountability as standards and expectations of mutual accountability between donors, recipients, and partners. He also goes ahead and says and underscores the fact that measuring and evaluating accountability inherently reflects values. And these values, he underscores key declarations where they enshrine such as the Paris Declaration on Aid Effectiveness that refer to ownership, alignment, harmonization, inclusive partnership, results, and accountability. Now, it's also very important to know that as we get to understand what the common, I'll get to a common understanding of what aid accountability is, there are trade-offs that are supposed to be made or could be made. And these should be in tandem with recognizing that the aid accountability process should be mutual and participatory and should respond to concerns such as does the aid or the purpose for the aid fit within the respective strategy documents such as strategic plans or development plans of respective countries or geographies. Do the recipients of aid even understand what the aid is meant for or what it's meant to do? Do they appreciate the whole spectrum of aid accountability or even have the power to make decisions on how aid is supposed to be provided or utilized? The other bit is that the beneficiaries, the communities, the citizens empowered enough with the knowledge and skills to monitor and challenge the governments that be or the aid development partners on the effectiveness of the aid that is being provided, and how can then the role of civil society be leveraged as being pivotal to the accountability process. I want to go ahead and say that civil society certainly can play a crucial role. We've seen this over time in different sectors. Number one is that their role in evidence generation is very key. And this evidence can be through primary or secondary sources and can be packaged and shared in terms of voices as well. And I like the term that was mentioned earlier, anecdotal evidence as well, shared as voices to the powers that be, to the stakeholders that are involved in the aid accountability spectrum. But then it's also key to note that the tracking of whether the purpose for the aid is actually being executed as desired. Are there any deviations? Are there any concerns? Are there any issues that are being raised? And secondly, how then can you be at the table as civil society to speak about those issues? So participation and amplification of the issues identified in the aid accountability process, such as holding policy dialogues or being part of discourses in that regard, participation in working groups, or even really strongly holding all the parties involved in the process or in the spectrum accountable is quite crucial for civil society to do. I don't want to mention a number of them. I know Mimdu mentioned a couple of them. I want to quickly delve into the issue related to, the weaknesses that I've seen over time due to my engagements and participation within the civil society space. Number one, I recognize that there's limited involvement of civil society in the aid accountability process. A number of times being influenced by either being recipients of aid and hence fearing to challenge the status quo for fear of losing the aid that is being provided. So people tend to safeguard their space by not speaking out because you're benefiting from the person that you're supposed to challenge. So that compromises you and therefore limits you from engaging them. The second thing is that not so many civil society organizations have the requisite institutional capacity. Here I want to underscore human resources, the technical skills, e.g. in budget analysis or advocacy, and also the funds to engage in aid accountability discourses. This goes in very closely with limited funding or even limited availability of unrestricted funding for these initiatives to continue. We realize that not so many donors support aid accountability initiatives. This poses a great question or a big question of what innovations should we contextually adopt at national, regional, continental, or global levels to ensure that aid accountability is sustained, or the initiatives, without much reliance on the global north. And I know that one of the speakers mentioned that the COVID situation actually taught us a lesson on the need for or health sovereignty. You cannot prioritize somebody who is not your countryman or countrywoman in the terms of the provision of services. In this case, I want to underscore, for example, the vaccines before serving your very own. And this we saw during the distribution and of the COVID vaccines within Africa itself. The other bit that I want to highlight is that there is limited data or access to information on the aid that is being provided. And this, you find that there's a lot of comfort by the donors to share information with the governments that be. And when they share this information, it's shared in a very technical way that even the ordinary person may not be able to access this. One other thing that comes up that is very challenging also in this environment is that the policy environment sometimes shrinks the space, the engagement space on aid accountability. And this breeds in fear and a lot of disinterest in aid accountability initiatives. In some countries that I don't want to highlight here, you'll find that there are a number of policies that do not support, especially civil society interests. One, for being misconstrued as either supporting parties that are not ruling in the governments that be, and hence limiting their engagements. And this is happening quite a bit, especially here in Africa. Now, the other question that I was given is that how can we work around building a robust civil society community that can guarantee aid accountability given the current attempt like localizations that have been articulately talked about, but also work broadly around decolonizing health in Africa. And I know Alicia mentioned a number of these, but I want to go back here. I think for me, in my own perspective, and from my observation, is that development partners or the partners involved should really look at investing in more long-term institutional development of civil society organizations, underscoring the systems within the organizations, but above all, ensuring that we have the requisite skills and that goes with the human resources. But also, how else can we ensure that this funding that is being provided is unrestricted to ensure that the growth happens? Alicia talked about the local organizations of civil society being primes in the definition of localization, if that's the direction we want to go into. I see this happening a little bit with the AID now, especially where I sit in Uganda. But the question is do they have the requisite systems that can sustain being the prime without any influence of having a sub from the global north, taking a lot of advantage and maybe making the hard decisions. And then the issue of increasing data, access to data and information in user-friendly formats for CSOs to engage with, especially from governments and development partners, is very key. Without evidence, you can definitely not engage meaningfully. You will probably be run down because you don't have any robust source that you're citing and any facts that you're sharing to be credible enough. Then the governments and development partners should ensure that there are frameworks that provide an enabling environment for civil society and aid accountability initiatives. I cannot prescribe. I know there are many examples perhaps online here, and we shall really look forward to listening to some of the examples and cases that will be shared in the conversation. But then I think having a more coordinated function among a civil society by either creating appetite for a regional, continental, or global movement on aid accountability is something that we need to pursue closely. So with those very few remarks that have been random thoughts, I would like to hand over to Shenaz to take us through the Q&A if possible. Yeah, thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much for those rich thoughts. And you've really set us on you've charted a course for us to think about. I really hope that what we can do is take the script of this webinar and put it down and perhaps take some of these ideas and really unpack them, and it becomes a start towards developing a priority list of the way forward, because we are unpacking the issues, we understand them as part of an ongoing project of coloniality that is going to continue and continue and continue until we in Africa, within solidarity with those who support us, disrupt that coloniality and find a way to not just disrupt, but to chart a course for our own liberation. So I thank you. I'd like to now open for questions and for comments. The floor is now open for everyone. So please either put your hand up and speak, or write your question into the chat box and I will read it. So you see lots of people sharing their names and where they're from. I think you've just raptured everybody, William. So everyone's still thinking. Danny, go ahead.
Wow, what a wonderful sharing and learning from all of you. I want to thank all of you comrades for sharing that. And we really, you've given us a slap on the back of the head to reimagine how we even think around these issues. I think I want to make a little bit of two comments in regards to localization of aid. I think I'm proposing a paradigm shift. The Americans that I have opportunity to talk to, I am emphasizing the shift towards a narrow view of poverty. Their aid is more focused on issues around poverty rather than addressing the broader issues of inequality and how that can be, inequalities can be dealt with and in a much more sustainable way. And then secondly, they dissociate themselves from the problems that have led to the poverty. And that crowds their imagination to think about themselves as benevolent, as benefactors, people that are doing good in the world. If you read their literature or listen to their statements, particularly the politicians, they look at themselves as, this beacon of hope, seated on the shining hill or whatever they used to describe themselves. But they do not recognize the problems that they've led, the sucking out of resources from Africa, for instance, the wars they've created. So I want their localization to also recognize the contributions of the mistakes committed by their power. Lastly, I think it is Jonathan Glennie who talked about global public investment. I think we're being locked up in a narrow view of, aid. Can we reimagine financing mechanisms that are looking beyond? I do not agree with everything that Jonathan articulates in his book. It's a book about the future of aid. I think the future of aid, something like that. But I think I would really, really want people to look at it because he also emphasizes the aid and how it is patronizing, the language it is using, foreign aid. So to us, looking beyond so that people can appreciate that it is a collective world. We are all human beings. The borders must break. Human beings must share resources that are available to the earth equitably, and those left behind because of our history are supported to get to the level they should be. I thank you.
Thank you, Danny. I'm not sure if there was a question in there, it was just a comment, but I think you've really also raised an issue of reimagining financial systems. So I don't know if William, Alicia, or Hamimu, if you've got a comment or if you would like to add on to what Danny's saying. I think especially now in the context of COVID-19, it does become really difficult to think about where the priorities for finances lie. And we've seen changes in the WHO, we've seen changes in many of the, I guess, with the war in Russia and the Ukraine, there's been a lot of shifts, you know, so in that context, it does leave the continent in a bit of an uncertain space. So Ravi, I'd like to call you in, and then I'd let Hamimo, I see you've unmuted, so I'll give you a chance after Ravi. Thanks.
Hi, thanks Shanaz, and thanks to all the speakers, William and Himimu and Alicia. I put a question in the chat, and it's really just to see, it's coming to the point of the webinar, to what extent really is localization moving us toward decolonization? Or is it in some ways a shadow? Are we looking at the fact that resources go to Western institutions and trying to change that rather than change what's really driving things? Himimu gave some very good examples about the policy and the other context that influences how aid really works. And maybe it just makes sense to start exploring that further. We also had some very good examples about where change can happen, but I think there's many more examples about where local organizations can either be hijacked to execute a foreign agenda or a foreign decided agenda, or coming back to some of the original points that Alicia and Shanaz brought out, that the power dynamic has not changed. There's still a donor, and the donor sees themselves as a donor, as Danny was pointing out also with that narrative. So I can go on, but let's hear from maybe a quick note from William and Himimu and Alicia, and then I'd like to hear from some others who are listening in and see to what extent is localization really not just the answer, but even part of the answer.
Thank you. Himimu, you can go ahead first, and then I'll go to Alicia and then William. Thanks.
Yes, thanks a lot. Very quickly, I just wanted to respond to the question you threw at us, that if there are other models that are out there, the mechanism of funding. And yes, I just wanted to share some of the conversations that are going on at the moment. So we are having ideas, dialogues around alternative ways of funding other than aid, because like you have said, there's a problem with the aid narrative. It's patronizing. And also the giver also follows it into the localities where it's being spent. Yeah, but I think what the global investment idea talks about is about pooling resources together, okay? Every country contributing based on their capacity, based on their GDP. So America will contribute a big amount, just like a big amount of money compared to, let's say, to another country like Rwanda. But when it comes to spending, spending is based on need. Okay, so America can contribute into the pool, but then it may not take out of the pool because it may not have problems. But South Sudan can take out of this pool and handle those issues. It's a new way of handling things. It's still being discussed, but I think there are some of the ideas that we need to start engaging with more and more alongside localization, or rather aid. Last year, within this Kampala initiative, we conducted some consultation processes on alternative names for aid, and stakeholders told us, no, the name is wrong, we need to have an alternative one, a more empowering one. And they gave us a list of them. One of them was the global redistribution, I think, which also links in very well with Jonathan's idea. We need to redistribute resources equitably, not equal, equitably, based on need and stuff like that. But also, what is very critical is to reframe how we're looking at things. I think addressing poverty is so narrow. There are other issues beyond poverty that are holding people in poverty, and that are not targeted by the current funding mechanisms, which I think Dan has ably articulated: the geopolitics, the issues to do with gender inequalities, very many things are happening around that are holding people into poverty. So I think we need to also to reframe that from poverty to addressing inequalities. We need to end inequalities. I think that changes the whole frame. I will end by saying that for HPA, Health Poverty Action, where I come from, our partners in the Global North are already having conversations, okay? They're building a movement around there on how they can shift this narrative from that one of ending poverty to one of tackling global inequalities. And they want to influence international development institutions like FCDO and probably USAID at some point, so that they can change their mandate. They stop looking at sending money to Africa to come and help people. No, they should come and end inequalities and also address some of the issues probably that they are a part in terms of causing them. Just wanted to say that. Thank you.
Thank you, Hamimu. I think what's really powerful about your intervention is that you're making us aware of the coloniality of knowledge. And the moment you continue and push the word poverty, there's a whole emotional component and a kind of savior complex that comes in. But once we start talking about global inequalities, it shifts, or inequities. We start shifting, and in this redistribution language, we're shifting the ball game, and we're making it much more of a global imperative that all of us are part of creating, and all of us can be a part of being the solution. So thank you for that. Alicia has commented in the chat. She says, to give time to my colleagues, I'd like to answer here. At worst, localization will simply be a continuation of the status quo by Global North actors. And at best, it will be a shorter term approach on the road to decolonization, where dismantling current systems results in new ones, determined and controlled by truly local actors. I guess the question for us is, how can we ensure that we move towards the best scenario instead of the worst? William, I'd like to ask you to share your comments. And unfortunately, we are heading towards the end of the webinar. So if anybody's got any final comments, I'd love you to please share your questions in the chat box, so we can keep them and keep the conversation going. Thank you. Go ahead, William.
Thank you so much, Shanaz. And I like what Alicia posted in the chat, and I subscribe to it wholesomely. I think for me, localization is not the magic bullet for decolonization. It's not at all. My view is that probably it's just a step towards decolonization. But the question is, do the local partners, or will the local partners really have the power to influence and challenge the decisions of the aid that is being provided? I think for me, it still keeps to the skewed power imbalance, and that's something that needs to be addressed. I don't have the right answer right now, but for me, I don't think it leads us to decolonization, but it could probably be a step to decolonization, and we can continue with the debates, and probably there are many other schools of thought that may come from the participants. Thank you so much.
I just like to just piggyback on what you were saying, William, that for me, decolonization is not an end point. It's never going to be an end point. As humans, we will always create and recreate systems of power. I think we're looking to go towards social justice. That's the goal. Decoloniality or decolonization it's a lens. It's a lens with which we can look at the same old problems from a new approach, because we've been talking social justice for years. But our problem is that we haven't really contextualized social justice within the histories of oppression for the longest time. And in doing so, we have reified the injustices by finding solutions that fit within the system, rather than to dismantle or delink from the system of the empire or oppressive power. And I think for me, the decolonial lens is actually saying, but we have missed a whole lot in this conversation. We need to have a new lens. We need a paradigm shift. We need to open our eyes towards understanding the problem a little bit better. And the more we develop an understanding of the problem, each time we reclaim a little bit more of our power, and that helps us to sort of shift away. Because I do think it is time as Africans that we find a way to recognize that we are sitting on a continent with a lot of wealth, of resources, of sunshine, of care, of culture, of concern, and I suppose we've lost our confidence in all of that, and the decolonial lens can help to sort of unpack in what ways have we dehumanized ourselves, and in what ways do we need to start rehumanizing ourselves as African women, as African children, as African men, so we don't fit into the tropes of what the Western gaze kind of forces us to be, so that we can then, from a place of deep strength, determine that agenda that we've been trying to speak to today. So we have Jonathan Glennie from one who I see has Hamimo has pointed me to. So I'd like to invite you to speak to us if you've got something to share, please.
I'm so sorry I was late for this meeting. I really would like to get the video. I just caught the end of I'm in Colombia, so it's early here, and I just caught the end of Hamimu's comments, and I couldn't agree more. And I just shared a note in the chat with Noura Lester Murad. I've been working with for many years. She's Palestinian aid expert, and her view is that you can't even decolonize aid. So of course you move towards the process of decolonizing. You know, that's important. That's where we're at. You know, the aid structure exists, but fundamentally it is a colonial construct. And therefore, we have to build a separate structure. We have to live in the now. We have to do the best that we can, and at the same time, build a separate structure over time. And we have to have the ambition to be able to do that. And I feel that, you know, in the 2020s, it's time that we were able to be bold enough to do that. And it depends a lot of course, on the context, on the geopolitical context. Are we going to be able to? Many people have tried before, usually from the South Africa. I'm here in Latin America. So many times it's been tried. Maybe this time, given a very different world than it was in the 70s or even in the early 2000s. And given what COVID has done to people's kind of, I guess, analysis of what's possible at the globe and what isn't happening. So that's what I'm working on at the moment with some people on this call, but really keen to engage in this initiative of yours as well.
Thank you so much for that, and welcome. It's lovely to see the solidarity building across the continents. This is what is going to help us to see that we actually are in the majority. We are not in the minority as people. And so we do have a power if we start building that solidarity across continents, across shared lived experiences, and to recognize that the colonial project was trying to divide and separate us in our homes, in our communities, across race, across gender, and actually dismantling those come first so that we can then see common ground and recognize that a new world is possible. The decolonial project is going to lead us there, but ultimately we need to be very clear of what is our goal. What will we be willing to accept? How will we no longer be willing to be treated by those who have simply a fake kind of power, a fake money, financial, whatever power that's not real, it's not tangible, it can be changed. So I'm just trying to shift it to say, let's see that the strength that we have as people may be stronger than a financial system. Even though right now it's not the case, it's something we can aspire to. Yeah. I don't know if I'd like to, it's at 2 o'clock, so this is the end point of the webinar. I've got to go to another meeting now. So I think I'd like to just have a 30-second roundup of all the panelists. and then we can end the webinar. So we'll just start with Alicia, and then Hamimu, and then William. Thank you.
I won't even take 30 seconds, Jenny. I just want to say thank you all so much for thoughtful and honest and amazing questions. I hope this dialogue continues. Please feel free to invite me back. I'll come back anytime. Please keep in touch for anyone who's interested. I want to make sure the slides are shared out. I hope this is a conversation that continues. And I hope for Global North actors like where I sit and where I work, if solidarity is not the goal, I hope you all know there's no reason to engage. And if there's not a shared long-term collaboration and understanding, it's not even worth a relationship, or not worth having such a relationship. So I just want to say that, and thank you all so much.
All right, thanks a lot, everyone, for being with us through this lively conversation. I just wanted to say 2 words. One of them is that we need to reimagine solidarity from building it around the aid concept, localizing aid to something more meaningful. I think the world around us has changed us, and pandemics like COVID have also helped us. We need to react and build better, a more equitable world. So I think that's the new way of looking at things. The last thing I also wanted to say is that changing the system is not enough, okay? We also need to change the mindset. I think when we have localization, we're trying to change the system, but we're not changing the mindset. So we still do the same old things within the new system. So thanks a lot, and I hope we enjoy the rest of our day. Thank you.
Thanks. I'll take over from Amimu. I know time is up. I would like to thank every one of you and just join in communion with Alicia and Amimu. My interest is really to sustain the momentum of the conversations, just like Alicia said. It should not stop at this. We should sustain that momentum that will yield greater impact. I know there are very many out there that would be interested in listening. And if possible, also inviting in, some of these big names that are funding, providing aid across continents so that we hear their perspectives. I'm sure some of them could be here. I don't know all of them anyway, but that could be one of the next steps. Thank you so much and have a good day.
Thank you all. I would like to invite anyone who's willing to contribute or continue these conversations to get in touch with Jovia, Frank, Danny, Ravi, myself, or even Hamimu, Alicia, William, Jonathan, all the people who are part of this conversation today. Bring your voices. We need your contributions. And I'd like to take what Hamimu was saying. Let's shift our minds and let's shift our hearts and let's do with our hands, because we have the power and we are important. We matter, So this is our lives, and this is the lives of Africans that matter.